In a
think
world
this
of
is a
power,
joke?
secrets,
You
and
think I
betrayal,
wanted this? You
one
ruined
moment
my
changes
life.
everything. At 30 weeks pregnant,
wait,
Claire
please
believed she was
don't.
building a future, until one shocking act shattered the illusion. Behind the polished image of a perfect marriage lay lies, manipulation, and a carefully orchestrated
You're
betrayal
finally
that had
here.
been unfolding for years.
I was so worried.
But when Claire finally
okay
uncovers
now,
the
Dad.
truth, she doesn't
We
break,
both are.
she rises. And what follows isn't just the fall of a man, it's the collapse of an empire and the rebirth of a woman who refuses to be silenced.
Please,
This
just give me
story
5
reminds us,
minutes. I didn't know where else to
sometimes
go.
the hardest truth to accept
said it's
is the
over,
one we've
James. You
always
need to
known
leave.
deep down. Ignoring red flags doesn't make them disappear. It only delays the moment they change everything. Walking away isn't weakness, it's courage. And choosing yourself may be the most powerful decision you ever make. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt real to your own journey, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel so we can keep bringing you more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
At 32 weeks pregnant, Eleanor was confined to her bed in their San Francisco penthouse, a medical-grade band across her stomach displaying her son's steady, reassuring heartbeat on a wall-mounted screen, 148, 148, 148. Her husband, Marcus, walked in. He didn't ask about the stress-induced contractions. He didn't glance at the vital signs. He demanded to know why she was auditing his VP's expense reports. A team-building retreat, he claimed. She told him the car's GPS logs showed he was in Napa, not Singapore. He called her paranoid. Then his arm flashed out from his side, creating a sound like a switch being thrown, the stark, clean impact of an open palm against a woman's cheek in the soundproof quiet of their minimalist home, the one place she was supposed to be safe. She flinched, her own hand rising to the sudden blooming heat on her face. The monitor never wavered, 148, 148. The rhythm of her unborn son, a constant, unaware pulse. Her husband adjusted the collar of his designer shirt and strode out of the room. With trembling fingers, she picked up her phone. She sent a text to her father with just 4 words. The algorithm is compromised. The fallout over the next 48 hours would do more than dissolve a marriage. It would obliterate a multi-billion-dollar tech empire on the eve of its IPO. Because the man who had just assaulted his pregnant wife had overlooked one simple, world-shattering detail. Her father was the legendary venture capitalist waiting for a single, justifiable reason to reclaim the company his daughter had built. And he had just been given one. Stay with Eleanor. Because the truth she uncovers about the 2 years leading to that slap is profoundly more shattering than the physical blow itself. And the powerhouse she builds from the ashes is the chapter of this story you will absolutely not predict. Before we go on, this story is for anyone who has ever shrunk themselves to make a partner feel powerful, who has consistently rationalized away the warning signs, who has held on to a belief in a person who may have never truly existed. This story is evidence that escaping a life that was suffocating your soul isn't a defeat. It is the beginning of a resurrection. If this resonates with you, if any part of this feels like a memory you have lived through, seen, or held in silence, please demonstrate your support by liking this video and leaving a comment. Tell us what part of the story hit you the hardest. Your stories forge a connection for others who believe they are navigating their struggles alone. Share this with anyone who needs to hear this. And if you're new to our channel, subscribe and join our community. Every story we tell is for women who are prepared to speak their truth about what truly matters. You are why we are here. The fetal monitor beeped, its rhythm a serene digital pulse. It remained completely untroubled by the tempest gathering in the master suite of the penthouse at 1 Rincon Hill. It just maintained its unwavering pace, 148, 148, 148. Eleanor Vance was 32 weeks pregnant. She was propped up by a mountain of pillows, the silk of her pajamas a stark contrast to her profound weariness. Her blonde hair was tied back in a messy bun, and the shadows of exhaustion were painted beneath her eyes after days of a high-risk pregnancy threat, stress-induced contractions, and the deep cellular fatigue of creating a human being. The private nursing staff had been angels. They knew her preferences without consulting their charts and brought her herbal tea when the San Francisco fog rolled in, casting a chill over the bay. A nurse named Maria had stayed with her for nearly an hour the night before, talking quietly about anything and everything, a comforting human presence against the hum of the apartment's integrated technology. The recessed smart lighting, however, was less compassionate. It cast a cold, clinical glow over everything. Eleanor was mesmerized by the monitor displaying her son's heart rate, 148 beats per minute, strong, consistent, and completely innocent of the world outside. She had been tracking the number for almost an hour when the door slid open silently. Marcus Thorne entered. He was 45, lean, and wore the uniform of a Silicon Valley king, a tailored Tom Ford suit with no tie, a crisp shirt, and leather sneakers that cost more than most people's laptops. The screen of his phone lit up with a stream of notifications. He had come straight from a board meeting. He hadn't bothered to decompress or arrange his features into a mask of concern. He didn't say hello. He didn't inquire about their son. He tossed his keys into a ceramic bowl on the dresser and shot a dismissive look at the medical readouts on the wall. His attention was brief, annoyed. "Why are you running forensics on Camilla's expense reports?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. The first volley from a man who had already decided she was guilty. Eleanor just looked at him. "Marcus," she started, her voice fragile. "The doctor said my blood pressure is—" "I know what the doctor said," he cut in. "I'm asking why you're digging through company financials like a disgruntled accountant. My assistant said you were demanding access to the server logs." "I didn't demand anything, and your assistant is mistaken." The emotional temperature of the room dropped. Not a sudden plunge, but a slow, creeping chill. It was the kind of change in pressure that signals an earthquake is imminent. Marcus fixed his gaze on her. "Do not contradict my executive assistant," he said, his voice deceptively calm. It was the tone he used right before firing someone, a quiet that was far more threatening than shouting because it signaled the decision was already final. "Marcus, I designed the back end. I know that a Napa wellness retreat—" She stopped. He glanced at the monitor, at the number. 148. His eyes returned to hers with a look she had spent 5 years learning to decode. It was the expression that meant he was running scenarios, calculating risks, and identifying the most direct route to reestablishing control. "You're making me look weak," he said. "You saw an expense report you didn't like, and instead of trusting me, you started pulling GPS data from the company car. It's inappropriate. A $10,000 charge for a spa weekend isn't a business expense, it's a cover story. It was a strategic planning session. You weren't meant to be involved. You're on medical leave. You used your board credentials to spy from your bedroom, and you're undermining my leadership right before our IPO. Because you were about to write off a romantic getaway with a woman using our company's money. That is no longer your department." The silence that descended was thick and heavy, filled with years of things left unsaid. Eleanor stared at the monitor. 148. 148. She took a breath. "You're right," she whispered, and felt a tiny piece of her own foundation give way as she said it. "I should have come to you. I'm sorry." She watched his face, waiting for the telltale sign, the slight softening around his eyes that meant the conflict was resolved. This was the dance. She would back down. He would be magnanimous. The tension would dissipate. Their world would reset. But this time, the dance was different. "The investors are getting nervous," he said, "about your intensity, your judgment. They feel your emotional state right now is a liability." "My emotional state?" she repeated, her voice barely audible. "Marcus, I am 32 weeks pregnant with our son. This isn't an emotional state. I am trying to protect the company," he said, his voice lowering to the register that meant the matter was, in his mind, officially closed, at least for him. Your behavior is creating complications. Complications I have to deal with on top of securing a $60 billion valuation. She thought, be quiet, just let it go. Wait for the anger to burn itself out. She had used those words as a shield 1,000 times. She repeated them silently now, in her bed, 32 weeks pregnant, with a child whose health depended on her staying calm. But then she glanced at his phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up, a notification from their smart home app. The preview text was unmistakable. Camilla is arriving. Main entrance. He wasn't even trying to be discreet. She said, Camilla is a parasite bleeding this company dry and you're letting her do it. The slap came from his right side. It was not a closed fist. It was not a shove. It was the flat, open palm of his hand, moving with shocking speed, connecting with her right cheek. The sound was a sharp, ugly crack, an obscene noise in a room dedicated to preserving life. It was not a blow meant to cause physical injury. It was a blow meant to terminate a conversation, to assert dominance, to win. For 3 endless seconds, the world stopped moving. The monitor did not. 148, 148, 148. Eleanor's hand rose to her own face, her movements slow, as if her mind couldn't keep up with the signals her nerves were screaming. Her fingers touched the fire spreading across her skin, confirming its reality. It was real. In the ringing quiet that followed, Marcus stood by the door, straightening the sleeve of his jacket. He adjusted the cuff with the same meticulous, sharp gesture he used when dismissing a flawed algorithm, a quick, perfect motion. The door slid open. Maria, the nurse, came in holding a blood pressure cuff and a tablet. She was 28 and had been working in private care for 5 years. She'd seen couples at the peak of their joy and in the depths of their despair. Sophia possessed a rare intuition for reading the emotional temperature of a room in a heartbeat. She read this one now. Her face did something remarkable. It went utterly blank, a perfect neutral mask for a split second, a total freeze, before a professional warmth settled back over her features so fast you'd think you imagined it. Mr. Thorne, she said, her tone perfectly calm. I'm going to need to check Mrs. Thorne's blood pressure now. Marcus glanced from the doula to Eleanor. He grabbed his tablet from the credenza, his eyes refusing to meet his wife's. He slid it into his briefcase. He walked to the foyer, pulled the heavy oak door open, and was gone. The soles of his bespoke Italian shoes were silent on the limestone floor. The deadbolt slid home with a soft thud. In 3 swift movements, Sophia was beside her. She didn't say a word. She sat on the arm of the linen sofa, her actions practiced and serene as she placed a cool hand on Eleanor's wrist, feeling for her pulse. She held up 2 fingers and watched the second hand on her Cartier watch, 118 beats per minute, dangerously fast. Sophia studied Eleanor's ashen face, the terrified rhythm fluttering in her throat. She placed her phone on the marble coffee table. She asked, her voice a gentle murmur, Eleanor, what is the one thing you need me to do for you right now? Eleanor just stared out the window at the gray waters of Lake Michigan. The Gold Coast penthouse was silent. The city hummed 900 feet below. The baby gave a slow, deliberate turn inside her, an innocent shifting from a child who had no idea his world had just been fractured. Eleanor thought, I knew. Some small, quiet part of me always knew this was built on a fault line. She thought, I just never imagined it would break like this. She thought, I am 30 weeks pregnant on my own couch, and my husband just lied to my face before leaving for a business trip with his mistress. She turned to Sophia. Call my father, she said, her voice thin and sharp like glass. Arthur Vance, tell him Marcus just broke the Lexington Accord. Arthur Vance had shaped the political careers of senators and governors, building a consulting firm from a small Chicago office into a powerhouse of influence in Washington, D.C. He had done it over 30 years with an unnerving gift for seeing angles no one else could, a reputation for brutal efficiency, and the courage to back candidates everyone else had written off. He was in the middle of a tense negotiation on K Street, just a 90-minute flight from his daughter's home, when his secure line flashed with her name. He answered before the first ring was complete. Eleanor spoke only 5 words. "Dad, it was all true." Arthur Vance said, "I'm on the next flight." He was already moving. He ended the transmission, slid the encrypted phone into his suit jacket, gave a final, unarguable order to his stunned chief of staff, and exited the conference room without a backward glance. He bypassed the main elevator, using his private one instead. He reached the curb just as his car glided to a stop, the driver having read the unspoken urgency in his employer's gate. 90-minute flight, 20-minute drive. He arrived, his tie perfectly knotted, his reading glasses still nestled in his breast pocket from the meeting. He let himself into the Lakeshore Drive penthouse with his own key and stopped dead. He saw his daughter's face, the shattered stillness in her eyes. One of her hands was laid protectively over the high, round curve of her stomach. He recognized that look, the brittle composure of a person holding the pieces of their world together by sheer force of will. He crossed the enormous living room. He sat on the leather ottoman beside her armchair. He carefully took her free hand in both of his. His grip was warm and solid. She remembered being 7 years old, utterly convinced that no monster under the bed could ever get her as long as her father was holding her hand. She wasn't 7 anymore, but she clung to him. "Tell me," he said, his voice quiet, the kind of quiet that takes immense strength to maintain. It was the calm of a man who knew his daughter needed an anchor, and so he would become one, no matter the storm raging inside him. She told him about the printed travel itineraries, the late-night strategy sessions, the cloying scent of a gardenia perfume on his cashmere overcoat last month, the split second of vacancy in his eyes when she'd asked who wore it. Her hand tightened over her belly as she finished. Arthur remained perfectly still. The digital clock on the bookshelf read 3 p.m., 3 p.m. "Have you suspected this before?" Arthur asked. Eleanor's silence was the only answer he needed. "Never with proof," she whispered. Her eyes were locked on the tablet on the coffee table, still displaying the incriminating hotel confirmation. "Not confirmed. It was always just a bad feeling in my gut." Arthur didn't press her. He waited with the patience of a man who had lived 66 years and understood that a painful truth never emerges on a timeline. And then it began. Not as a neat story, but as a deluge. The kind of deluge that happens when a dam, covered in hairline fractures for years, finally shatters, and everything that was held back comes roaring out without order or mercy. The phone, the first year they were married. He was so secretive with his international phone, always setting it face down, quickly ending conversations if she walked into his home office. One night, she'd come downstairs for a glass of water around 2 a.m. and saw the glow from under the library door. Marcus was on the couch, illuminated by the screen, scrolling through messages on a discreet app with the detached, clinical focus of an architect reviewing blueprints. He had looked up and their eyes met. He showed no shame, no guilt. He had simply held her gaze with that cool, impenetrable expression and said, "A competitor is trying to poach my European team. This is counterintelligence," as if she were a child. She hadn't known how to argue, so she had accepted it. The silence that followed buried the moment, and they went back to their room. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. She had explained it away as his cutthroat business world. She had told herself that she, of all people, understood the immense pressure he was under. She had confused understanding his ambition with offering her support, and she had believed that unwavering support was the foundation of love. She had been wrong on all counts. The Foundation Gala. 2 years in, the Chicago Architectural Foundation's annual benefit, 200 of the city's most powerful people beneath a canopy of shimmering lights. The dessert plates were being taken away. As a former art curator, she had made a nuanced point about the lack of human scale in modern glass and steel towers, a subject she was passionate about before leaving her gallery to run their charitable foundation, a move Marcus had pitched as a synergistic brand alignment. It now felt like a gilded cage. She had made an intelligent, well-reasoned remark. Marcus had laughed, not a warm, private laugh, a loud, performative one for the whole table to hear. He patted her arm condescendingly and said, "Eleanor has her little artistic theories," and then instantly pivoted the conversation to the zoning victory his firm had just won for a new skyscraper, dismissing her as if she were a precocious toddler showing off a new trick. 200 people in the room. She had managed a tight, polite smile. She had taken a long drink of water. She did not bring up architecture again. She hardly spoke for the rest of the night. The baby announcement. She had found an original blueprint from his favorite architect and placed it on his desk with a note. To design our greatest project together. She had imagined the moment for weeks, filled with the giddy, hopeful energy of planning the perfect surprise. He had come home after 1 a.m. He saw the blueprint. He read the note. He had looked at her and said, "This is great. Hey, I need you to look over the seating chart for the Dubai investors' dinner." Then he kissed her on the forehead and went to his office to take a call. She had stood alone in his study for a long time, the rolled-up blueprint still on his desk. She had built an entire narrative in her mind. He shows his love through providing. He is building our future. My pregnancy hormones are making me oversensitive. He loves me. He just has a different way of expressing it. She had built a fortress of excuses and had taken up residence inside, willfully ignoring the cracks forming in its foundation. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur waited. "I think I knew. I think deep down, I always knew the ground was unstable." She drew in a shaky breath. "I just kept waiting for the man I fell in love with to come home." Arthur said, "Was that man ever really there to begin with?" The question landed with the soft finality of a closing door in the vast, quiet apartment. The silence that came after it stretched on, and she realized it was a silence that would now become a part of her life. She didn't answer right away, because the true answer, the one she was finally letting herself see, was devastatingly simple. She had no idea. She had wasted so much time waiting for a man to return that she never considered if he had been a phantom all along. "Oh God, I've been such an idiot," she whispered, the words finally escaping her. All the warning signs were there. Arthur didn't tell her she wasn't an idiot. He was too honest and had too much respect for her to offer a hollow comfort she would only have to argue against. And she didn't have the strength for that. He just squeezed her hand. Downstairs in the building's limestone lobby, Sophia Rossi was stepping out of an elevator. She was sending a quick text message to her assistant, instructing her on how to manage the scheduling for a new client. As a maternity concierge for the wealthiest families in the city, she was a master of logistics and discretion. She registered the time, 3:42 p.m. She registered the chilling simplicity of the text she'd received from Arthur Vance. "Get to the penthouse. Eleanor needs you." She registered the doorman's overly solicitous nod, the way his eyes followed her toward the private elevator bank. She knew this address. She had reviewed the architectural plans for the nursery that was being built on this very floor. It was a digital fortress of his own design, a cloud server with encrypted folders that tracked every login, every download, all time-stamped. She tucked that detail away in her mind. She clicked on the folder labeled Nursery Designs. For a moment, she just stared at the login prompt, one hand resting on the swell of her belly. Then she typed their anniversary date, and the folder opened, not to pictures of cribs and mobiles, but to a life she was never meant to see. The life Julian had been building without her. Eliza saw the file's last modified timestamp. It was from 38 minutes ago. She was 34 years old, and she was about to become a widow to a man who was still breathing. Leo Vance approached every deal like a shark, sensing blood in the water, with lethal precision, relentless momentum, and no tolerance for weakness. He'd taken Eliza's call in the middle of a board meeting. The call had been less than 60 seconds long. He strode into the Gold Coast penthouse and stopped. He saw his sister's face, pale and unnervingly calm, a mask of stillness she wore to keep herself from shattering, and the way she sat in the nursery's glider, perfectly motionless, as if one real breath would splinter her into 1,000 pieces. Leo set his briefcase on the floor. His voice was low, laced with the cold fury he'd been suppressing for years. "I have never trusted him, Eliza. Not from the day you met him." Eliza looked up, her eyes hollow. "I know. I'm finished being diplomatic about it." "I know that too," she whispered. Leo knelt on the floor in front of his sister, the way he had in her dorm room at Northwestern 14 years ago when they were 20, and betrayals of this magnitude were things that only happened in movies. He didn't hug her, not yet. He just stayed there, a solid, unmovable force against the chaos. After a long minute, Eliza leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder. The antique ship's clock on the mantel chimed 5 times. Down the hall, in his study overlooking Lake Michigan, Julian put down his phone. He pulled up his recent calls and pressed a single name. The call connected before the first ring even finished. "Arthur," Julian said. His voice had changed. It wasn't angry. It was heavy, like cooling steel, colder, absolute. "Clear your calendar. I need you in my office, now." "The main conference room, and when you get here, bring the original incorporation documents for Croft Development. The entire file, every single page." Arthur Sterling, his lead counsel, asked, "What kind of fire are we putting out?" "He built an entire second life behind my sister's back. She is 35 weeks pregnant." There was a dense silence on the line that lasted exactly 2 heartbeats. "I'm 15 minutes out," Arthur said. "And Leo?" "Yeah? I'm reaching out to my contact at the Tribune's business desk, just to have the weapon loaded." Leo let out a breath that was half grief, half Arctic resolve. "Good," he said. He ended the call. He stood in the penthouse, the muffled sounds of the city he was learning to conquer filtering through the windows, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the L train, all of it dissolving behind one single crystalline purpose. The quiet hum of the building's climate control and the soft ticking of the clock seemed deafening, and she gave herself 1 minute. She let the rage build, a white-hot inferno she knew her brother couldn't bear to witness. Then she banked it, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked back into the living room. Eleanor Vance arrived in less than 20 minutes. She was 68 years old, with silver hair cut in a sharp, elegant bob, and moved with the placid certainty of a woman who had spent 4 decades dismantling the fortunes of Chicago's most powerful men, knowing that the truly powerful never had to shout. She placed her slim leather portfolio on the marble coffee table and a single file next to it. She exchanged a look with Leo that spoke of a long and bloody history of battles won together. She then turned to Eliza with the gentle, focused compassion of someone who had known her since she was a child and had no intention of treating this like just another case. She didn't open the folder right away. "Before we get into this," she said, her voice calm, I want you to tell me precisely what you saw on that server. Leo had called her an hour earlier, his voice a low, controlled vibration of fury, after Eliza had shown him what she'd found that afternoon. She had done it so quietly, not wanting to cause a scene. She was looking for architectural plans of their apartment to send to the nursery designer, sorting through files on their shared network. That's when she saw it. A folder named Ethelred, tucked inside a subfolder for tax documents. He'd told her it was old business, archived records. Curious, she'd clicked it. It wasn't password protected. Eleanor opened her file. It wasn't old business. It was a prospectus for a new business. It was a waterfront property he was developing, the one he'd been so secretive about, the project that required all those investor dinners that stretched late into the night, a series of minimalist, high-tech cabins on Lake Austin. It was a vision of sleek glass and steel, designed to feel, for the first time in her life, like a place she didn't belong. The deed had been filed 3 weeks prior. The co-owner listed wasn't her. She knew the aggressive forward slant of his signature anywhere, the sharp point on the J of his first name. Next to it, a flowing S and R, Sophia Rossi. His name printed with unwavering confidence on the paperwork for a venture he had called his legacy. She remembered the weight of that word when he'd said it. The first trimester had been exhausting, but she was finally feeling a spark of her old self again. Ethan had laid out a stack of documents on their marble island, next to a glass of the ginger ale she'd been living on. He'd explained their wealth manager needed them to restructure some tech investments. He'd claimed it was a standard procedure to optimize their tax burden. He'd called it simple housekeeping. She had signed where he pointed. She had believed him. The SRRE, her lawyer explained softly, stands for Sophia Rossi. The documents you signed authorize the transfer of a significant portion of your shared assets into a new tech incubator. Upon formal separation, she continued, reading from her notes, it activates a clause transferring his majority stake in Croft Development to this new entity. It also authorizes the complete liquidation of your joint investment portfolio to serve as its initial capital, leaving you with a predetermined settlement referred to in the text as a 5-year spousal appreciation bonus. She said the amount. Eliza didn't even blink. It also reclassifies marital property, Eleanor went on, to exclude all real estate holdings and future development contracts acquired during the marriage, assets that, according to your prenuptial agreement, are considered 50-50. The nursery was silent. Leo, standing by the window, looked like he could punch through the glass. Her brother was looking out at the Chicago skyline. He called it our dynasty, Eliza said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a flat, hollow statement of fact. The sound of a person accepting a truth so absolute it incinerates all emotion. The timeline of the financial transfers, Eleanor said, which my forensics team pulled from your accounts an hour ago, matched against the LLC's date of incorporation, reveals a deliberate campaign, a comprehensive financial and personal escape plan executed in advance. He called it our dynasty, Eliza said again. Her voice hadn't changed in volume, but it had changed in texture. It was harder now, like stone. Eleanor said, the good news is, he got greedy. You signed that trust amendment under fraudulent misrepresentation. His claim that it was for your estate planner is a verifiable lie. I spoke with your planner this morning. He has no knowledge of any such amendment. He was never involved. She paused. Furthermore, your brother's original seed funding contract explicitly states that my initial investment in Croft Development was secured by a personal guarantee from Julian against his entire net worth, her brother said from the window. That guarantee is ironclad. I am aware, Eleanor replied. Tell me what you require. An immediate emergency injunction to freeze every single asset, personal, joint, and corporate, and Eliza's formal consent to file. Both the lawyer and her brother looked at her. She was holding her phone, staring at the architect's rendering of a sun-drenched terrace in Napa, created during a time when she had felt cherished and secure and adored, and had been trying with every fiber of her being to be the kind of wife who was a champion for her husband's ambitions. She locked her phone. "You have it," she said. Eleanor gave one curt, decisive nod. She closed her portfolio. She started for the door. "Eleanor," Eliza said. The lawyer paused. "The vineyard, the money, the other woman." She took a slow, steadying breath. "How long has he been planning this?" Eleanor was quiet for a beat. "Based on the file creation dates on your server," she said, "the initial planning started at least 14 months ago." Eliza nodded once. The lawyer left. Leo waited until he heard the elevator doors slide shut, then said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, speaking with painstaking precision, "Amelia, I know," she replied. I need to be certain that you understand that I know, Ames." Her brother Ethan moved across the living room and enveloped her in a hug, holding her fast without another word, because nothing more could be said, and he knew it. Her mother moved away from the panoramic window. She took a seat on the arm of the sofa and placed a hand on Amelia's back. The three of them remained like that as the city lights began to sparkle below, and the setting sun stretched long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Amelia's eyes fell on the glossy brochure for the birthing suite on the coffee table. 18 months, she realized. 18 months of shared dinners, of designing a nursery, of mapping out a life with a man who was simultaneously architecting a completely separate future without her. 18 months she spent thinking they were a team, while he was quietly vetting her successor. 18 months of her dismissing her own gut feelings, of shrinking herself and becoming more agreeable, and convincing herself it was just part of being supportive. I curated myself for him, she thought. For 5 years, I made myself simpler, less curious, more blindly trusting, and I told myself it was love. It wasn't love. It was a complete deletion. I helped him code me out of my own story, and I called it being a good partner. This was not a descent into anguish. She could clearly separate the impulse for self-reproach from the cold, undeniable data. In the last hour, she had migrated to the side of pure data, and she planned to build her new reality there. The baby shifted within her, a slow, deliberate roll that felt like a silent agreement. Asterisk, we are still operational. The two of us are still here. Amelia rested a hand on her belly. I know, she whispered. We are going to be okay. She had no idea if that was true, but she said it anyway, believing that some futures must be articulated first before they can be instantiated, before they could materialize. For the next 5 minutes, the penthouse was hers alone. Her father, Marcus, had gone into the study to talk with her brother. A housekeeper had come in to clear away a tea service. Dr. Albright had checked the baby's heart rate on a portable monitor, given a reassuring nod, and left with the placid, unreadable look of a professional who observes everything and reveals nothing. The room was quiet. The digital clock on the wall kept its silent count. The city hummed around her, the distant clang of a cable car, the siren of an ambulance blocks away, the murmur of a conference call from the study down the hall. She refused to let herself think about attorneys. She refused to let herself plan the next move. She just dwelled in the new information, utterly still, the way a person must stop all motion to finally comprehend their own location. She watched her daughter's heartbeat pulse on the handheld screen. 145. Steady, resilient, a life entirely separate. Miles away, in his office overlooking the San Francisco Bay, Julian Vance's phone began to buzz without stopping. The first text was from his head of cybersecurity. Asterisk Julian, call me now. We've got a red flag event on the algorithm source code repository. The second was from his chief investment officer at a pension fund. The third was from the same CIO, this time flagged as urgent. The fourth wasn't a message. It was a push alert from a tech industry blog, a headline that was just background noise until it instantly became the single most important thing in the world. Thorn Industries announces immediate divestment from Vance Capital, citing fundamental breach of fiduciary trust. Statement by Marcus Thorn. Julian read it. He read it again. He called cybersecurity. "They're forking the repo," his guy said, his voice strained. "Someone is initiating a complete clone of the Q3 investment pipeline, and at the same time, how much?" Julian interrupted. The cybersecurity chief told him. A 4-second pause hung in the air. 4 seconds was a lifetime for Julian Vance to be silent. He said, "Have the Tesla at the curb." He made it to his Russian Hill penthouse in under 20 minutes. He had used the commute efficiently. He had recalibrated. It was a skill he had perfected over 15 years of pitching to skeptical investors. The swift assessment of a crisis, the identification of remaining leverage, and the adoption of the exact emotional tone required for the audience he was about to face. He had also made a mental note to clear his browser history. The bespoke leather of the private elevator was cool against his back as he rode to the penthouse floor, his phone in one hand, his other clenching and unclenching as he scanned his partner's frantic messages about the Thorn Industries capital call. He pocketed the phone as the doors whispered open. He walked down the hallway with the measured, confident stride of a man who truly believed any narrative could be rewritten with enough conviction. He had not expected to find Marcus Thorn in the Grand Salon. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Ethan by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sleek, dark tablet in his hand, Marcus in the leather armchair by Amelia's side, and Amelia herself, propped up by silk cushions, her hands resting on her bump with a serenity he hadn't seen in their 5 years of marriage. He looked at his own empty hands. He stepped into the room, placed his briefcase by the door, and took a position opposite the fireplace. He remained standing. To sit would be to accept that the current power structure in the room was permanent. "Marcus," he began, his voice exuding the warm sincerity of a reasonable man arriving to clear up a simple miscommunication. "Ethan, I'm so glad you're here. I was just on my way home. Amelia and we've had a tremendously stressful day. I just want to ensure everyone understands the full picture before we—" "What part of the picture are we missing exactly?" Ethan asked, his eyes fixed on the screen of his tablet. Julian's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. "Amelia has been under a huge amount of pressure. The pregnancy, the business, the stress. It's been a challenge for both of us. We had a disagreement, and it got out of hand in a way I deeply Julian." Amelia's voice was soft, but it sliced through the room like a fiber optic cable. No wavering, no emotion. He turned to her. She said, "You use the family concierge account." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Julian's gaze darted to the family's shared tablet, charging on a side table. He had been using that concierge service for years. It had never even crossed his mind to check the notification settings on the master account. He was definitely checking them now, in his head. She observed his mind at work, saw him running the risk analysis. She used to be so captivated by that mental speed, that raw processing power. She watched him calculate the fallout, assess the damage, and begin constructing a new pitch that might still work. "Amelia," he started, his voice shifting to a lower, more persuasive tone, the one he used during late-night strategy sessions in their Napa Valley home, in all the exclusive spaces he had built for them. The voice she once believed was the sound of a shared dream. "Whatever itinerary you think you saw this morning, we're not iterating on this," she said, her tone final. He froze. "Not for one more minute," she continued. "Ever." In 5 years, she had never addressed him with such immutable certainty. Saying the words cost her something profound, but the moment they were out, a small, vital piece of her own core programming reinstalled itself, solid and untouchable and entirely her own. Marcus stood. He was not a large man, but he possessed the dense, quiet gravity of a Silicon Valley legend. When Marcus Thorne looked at you, you felt the full weight of the industry. "Here is the new protocol," Marcus said, using the calm, direct tone of a man announcing a product launch. "Ethan filed an emergency injunction an hour ago to freeze all joint assets. The financial data is irrefutable. You will exit this apartment. You will cease all contact with Amelia, direct or indirect. All future communications will be routed through Ethan's firm." Julian began to say, "That is an absolute over." Additionally, Marcus went on, "Thorne Industries is formally invoking the personal conduct clause and rescinding our Series A seed funding commitment for the new Vance Capital 3 fund. The term sheet is now void. Formal notice is being delivered to your office right now." A change flickered across Julian's face. Not panic. Julian Vance did not do panic, but a deep, systemic shift, a core recalibration that went beyond the first. It was one that cracked the operating system of his entire company. The seed funding, the key person provision his own lawyers had dismissed as standard boilerplate. The clause that had 3 years prior felt like a massive vote of confidence from his future father-in-law, a symbol of their two dynasties merging. He finally saw it for what it had always been, a golden handcuff held by an incredibly patient man. "You can't," Julian said. "The LP agreement doesn't allow for a unilateral." "The agreement," Ethan said, finally looking up from his tablet, "contains a key person clause linked to executive behavior that could cause material harm to the fund's reputation or financial stability. A managing partner who executes a 7-figure wire transfer from a fund's capital account to purchase a private residence for his lead analyst, with immutable records of the transaction on the blockchain. Our legal team feels confident this represents a clear violation of the company's morality clause." A brief silence hung in the air. "They're prepared to litigate immediately," Ben continued. Julian's eyes were fixed on Amelia. She held his stare, her own expression unyielding. He couldn't find a trace of victory or regret in her gaze, only something harder and more permanent than either feeling. She was like an architect watching a controlled demolition from a safe distance, fully aware of the building's collapse, but forever clear of the fallout. "I deserved more," she realized, and the thought felt powerful and certain and true. "From the very start, I deserved so much more than this. This is a mistake you will regret," Julian threatened. She answered, "My life is already full of regrets. This will not be one of them." He spun around and walked out. The heavy door clicked quietly into its frame. A bouquet of white roses sat on a nearby table. No one made a move to touch them. They remained in their luxurious wrapping, their potent fragrance filling the sun-drenched hospital room, already starting to subtly wilt. A nurse came in less than a minute later. She had clearly been waiting in the hallway. She placed 2 mugs of hot tea on the table by the bed. Her eyes darted from the roses to Amelia, then to Amelia's father, Marcus, before she asked in the steady tone of someone who has anticipated a specific conclusion, "Well, is it done?" Amelia looked at her father, then at Ben, who was already murmuring into his phone in the corner, and finally back to the nurse. She said, "It's done." And for the first time since that morning, a sensation other than cold dread moved through her. It was a small, growing warmth, originating from deep within her that seemed to pulse with the gentle rhythm of her unborn child. It was hers alone. The nurse offered her a mug. The tea was an English breakfast blend, brewed a little too dark, with a splash less cream than she liked. Amelia said nothing. She cupped the warm porcelain with both hands, allowing the heat to seep into her skin. In a parking structure across the city, Julian Croft was already on a call. "What's our position?" Julian demanded. His COO, Kenji, responded, "The Morrison Group is pulling their backing from the Lakeside Tower project, and Lakeshore investors just put the entire next phase of financing on hold indefinitely. This is escalating faster than—" "Kill the Landmark Theater acquisition," Julian cut in. "The Preservation Board has to be hearing this chatter. They'll start getting skittish. Just kill it, Kenji." There was a pause. "I understand," Kenji said. He disconnected the call. He remained in his Tesla in the underground garage, his gaze fixed on a concrete column, reflecting on a decade of service. On every last-minute flight he had arranged, every discreet dinner reservation he had made and had chosen to see as none of his business. He shifted the car into drive. He had a 5-alarm fire to put out. Julian Croft didn't operate on feelings. He operated on leverage. He had constructed Croft Properties over 20 years on 2 guiding tenets: identify the hidden opportunity and possess the nerve to act before the rest of the market caught on. He could outmaneuver any competitor and move with a velocity no one anticipated. His whole empire was built in the gap between those 2 talents. By the time Julian's car reached the riverfront headquarters of Croft Properties, the Hayes Development Group had already released its official statement to 3 major news organizations. It mentioned a catastrophic failure of professional judgment and a material violation of the joint venture's personal conduct covenants. 2 of Marcus's top lawyers had spent the past 3 hours crafting the document. It was airtight, it was lawful, it made no mention of the affair or the downtown condo. It didn't need to. The story began to write itself. The calendar Amelia had discovered was naturally a private matter. But the abrupt withdrawal of 9 figures in capital from a flagship city development was a significant event requiring a public filing. An investigative journalist at the Chicago Tribune noticed the filing alert at 2:15 in the afternoon. She was exceptional at her job. She made 6 phone calls. She verified 2 critical pieces of information and cited an anonymous but senior-level source for the rest. 1,000 words. Precise, devastating. By 4 p.m., it was the top story on the paper's website. By 5, it was being discussed on Bloomberg. By 6, it had generated 75,000 search hits. Julian's public relations team released a response at 5:45. "This is a private family issue being exploited by a business rival through unfounded accusations." The statement was quoted widely. The term private family issue, however, deployed while the family member in question was in a high-risk obstetrics wing connected to a fetal monitor, did not land with the intended effect. By 10 that evening, the story had 300,000 search results. Amelia was released at 3 o'clock. Her contractions had stopped. Dr. Evans reviewed the monitor data, noted the dangerous spikes from the preceding 72 hours, and charted the improvement in the detached, specific phrasing of medical reports as happening after the removal of a significant environmental stressor. She stopped at the door of Suite 9, and took Amelia's hand. "You call me," she said, "for anything you or this baby needs, absolutely anything." Amelia squeezed her hand back, searching for the right words to convey her gratitude, but finding none. She managed a small, quiet nod. Dr. Evans understood it completely. Marcus drove her to the Hayes family's Gold Coast estate, the house where she'd grown up. She saw it as they approached the block. The familiar wrought iron fence, the tall elm trees her mother had fought to protect, the warm glow from the library windows pushing back against the encroaching lakefront fog. She sat in the passenger seat of her father's sedan. She remained in that passenger seat for a complete 5 minutes after her father had shut off the car's engine. She found she could not make herself move. It wasn't a feeling of fear or indecision. It was the certainty that the home beyond the fence was the world as it had been, and the moment she stepped through the door, her life would officially become the world after. She just required a few more seconds in the silent space between those two realities. Marcus stayed beside her. He didn't say a word, didn't glance at his phone. He just occupied the space with her in the dimming Chicago driveway, just as he had always sat with her through every painful moment of her life, simply present, a constant and dependable force. After 5 minutes, she finally reached for the handle. Evelyn Hayes was waiting for them in the foyer. At 65, with her graying hair styled in a chic bob, she carried herself with the air of a woman who, after 40 years married to Marcus Hayes, had perfected the art of grasping a crisis in a single glance. She took in her daughter's face and just opened her arms. The hug was complete, wordless, and absolute. She smelled of lilac and antique paper, and beneath it all, the unique fragrance that had always meant home. Amelia pressed her face into her mother's cashmere scarf and let herself finally, completely, break down. It wasn't a loud or dramatic collapse. It was the quiet type of disintegration that happens when you've been holding yourself together with nothing but pure will, and you at last reach the one place on earth where that strain is no longer necessary. Evelyn just held her. She didn't try to hurry the moment, didn't offer hollow assurances that it would all turn out fine. She was too wise and too direct to make claims about a future when her daughter was barely managing to endure the present. She just held on. When the wave of grief subsided, they moved to the kitchen. Evelyn filled a kettle for tea. The kitchen smelled precisely as it always had. The deep blue cabinets, the view of the churning gray lake through the bay window, a small board with cheese and crackers set on the marble island, the small kindness Evelyn always offered when a member of her family needed something tangible to ground them. They sat. They avoided the topic of Julian. They didn't discuss legal strategies or the financial fallout. Instead, Evelyn began telling a long, witty story about a dispute with the Landmark Commission over a new rooftop garden. Amelia almost smiled. It was a start. On the other side of the river, the atmosphere was quite different. In the conference room of Croft Properties, the tension was thick enough to taste. Julian was there, with his 3 main partners, his head of PR, and his 2 best attorneys on a secure video link. It wasn't chaos. Julian never allowed for chaos, but it was the sharp, fragile quiet that descends when extremely intelligent people fully grasp how deeply their position has been compromised. The news that the Hayes Development Group was pulling out of their signature project was not, by itself, a mortal wound. Croft Properties had enough capital to handle the financial impact, and with some swift negotiations, they could find new primary investors. The real problem was the message it broadcast. The Hayes family doesn't just walk away from a 10-figure development deal without an undeniable reason. That was a fundamental truth in Chicago's tight-knit real estate circle. When Marcus Hayes cited a profound breach of the partnership's ethics clause and dissolved the joint venture, other investment partners began making calls, not because they were scared, but because they were professionals who understood that Marcus Hayes' judgment had been impeccable for 40 years. Calls gave rise to questions, and questions gave rise to official inquiries. By 9 that night, both the Illinois Teachers' Retirement System and a major Singaporean investment fund had declared a suspension of all future investments in Croft Properties. By 10, the real estate blogs were ablaze. Daniel, Julian's earliest partner, stood by the massive window overlooking the lit-up bridges of the Chicago River. He thought about the 20 years he had spent building the company with Julian. He thought of all the dinners where Julian had brushed off one of Amelia's clever insights on urban planning, only to present the same concept as his own at a meeting the following Monday. He thought of the small, persistent ways a man can slowly and publicly diminish his own wife. He replayed every conversation where he decided it was none of his business. Stepping away from the view of the city, he spoke into the tense quiet. His voice was steady, infused with the conviction of a man who had just decided his conscience was worth more than his partnership track. Julian, this isn't a PR issue. You need to face what you've actually orchestrated. The air in the conference room grew heavy. Julian just stared at Liam. The look was glacial, analytical, and carried a threat that needed no words. He said, "You're off the Astor project, Liam." Liam picked up his satchel from his chair and his trench coat from the stand. He gave Julian a final look, one of profound disappointment for a man he once respected, but no longer knew. "I'm fine with that," he said, and walked out. The heavy glass door hissed shut. No one spoke. Julian turned back to the architectural model of the new tower that dominated the table. He picked up a laser pointer, intending to highlight the rooftop amenity space. "We press on," he commanded, his voice a mask of control. His hand was rock steady, but his thumb twitched, sending the red dot skittering in a chaotic line across the penthouse floors, like a bleeding scar. It looked like a deep flaw in the design. Not a single person in the room dared to breathe, because no one wanted to be the next to point out a truth that was painfully obvious. Blocks away, in a chic West Loop loft, a woman named Lena sat curled on her velvet couch, her face lit by the glow of her laptop. She was 29. She had been, or had told herself she was, the grammar of it all suddenly feeling impossibly complicated. Julian Croft's partner for 2 years. She knew he was married when they met. He'd explained it on their third date with a cool logic that had felt so modern and reasonable. The marriage was a merger of two real estate dynasties, emotionally defunct for years, maintained only until the complex family trusts could be untangled. A formality. She had bought it. She had bought into all of it. Now she was looking at an email chain forwarded by a friend in accounting. It was a flagged transaction request from their shared client, Julian's firm. She remembered the agitated call she'd gotten from him that afternoon, his voice strained with a pressure she had never heard. "The new retainer has to be executed today," he'd urged. "Sign the authorization for the Nevis Holding Company. It's to protect your agency's capital." A new payment structure, he'd explained it, a necessary buffer to shield her boutique agency from the mess of his acrimonious family settlement. She stared at the agreement on her screen, at the indemnification clause she'd almost scrolled right past. Some deep, nagging instinct had made her download a copy of the original project scope from her own server before getting shared access to his. Now she knew why. He wasn't trying to protect her agency. He was trying to use it as a shield for his. The last piece of the elaborate fiction he'd built had just shattered. She let the cold, hard reality settle into the marrow of her bones. Then she opened a private browsing tab. She searched for the lead counsel at Croft Legacy Holdings, a formidable attorney named David Chen she'd read about in a Crane's Chicago business profile. She found his direct line. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment before finally tapping the call icon. David Chen answered at 10:15 that night. He was in his home office because David Chen was always on call when the Croft family's interests were at stake. He listened without interruption. He asked only 2 clarifying questions. He thanked Lena, assured her that she had done the right thing, and stated that he would be in touch by 9 o'clock the next morning. He then placed a call to Marcus. Marcus called Isabel. Isabel was staying at her family's lakefront estate in Lake Forest, in a sunroom she had loved since she was a girl. It had the same pale blue walls she had begged her mother to change as a teenager, a color she now found deeply calming. She had slept, a heavy and blessedly dreamless sleep, from midnight until 8. She had been sure she would spend the night staring at the ceiling, her mind a frantic mess of worry. But her body had asserted its own will, like an animal seeking shelter from an approaching storm. She was sitting in the window seat, watching the morning light break across the vast gray expanse of Lake Michigan when her father's call came. Her mother was already outside in her sprawling English garden, carefully pruning her roses with the intense dedication of someone bringing order to the world. That marketing consultant, Lena, she contacted David last night, Marcus said, his tone even. Isabel took in the news. What does she want? Isabel asked. To help, he said after a brief pause. Walk me through it, she replied. And this is what Lena had stumbled upon, without ever grasping the full picture she was assembling, 18 months of a meticulously documented campaign. Server archives for a confidential initiative codenamed the Astor Project, which was actually a sophisticated effort to build a psychological profile of her. There was a data map showing a planned transfer of her private emails and journals, timed to finalize the profile 1 week before her baby was due. Encrypted communications between Julian and his private attorney from over a year ago, workshopping the precise legal phrasing that would depict Isabel's desire for privacy during her pregnancy as a pattern of dissociative behavior and emotional fragility. And there were chat logs from a secure messaging app where Julian detailed his plan to file for sole custody, claiming her obsessive focus on architectural history rendered her an unfit mother. He had been designing this takedown before their son was even conceived. David Chen relayed the summary to Isabel over the phone. He read it in a calm, dispassionate voice, stripped of any judgment, because he knew that what she needed most was the cold, unassailable truth. When he was done, she was silent for a long time. She looked out at the garden, at her mother's gloved hands moving with gentle precision among the green leaves, tending to what was alive and real. At last, she asked, Is she safe? The consultant, Lena? David said, We have already taken measures to ensure her security. She is fine. Isabel gave a small, slow nod to herself. He must have told her our marriage was just a business arrangement. She said softly, more a statement than a question, that he was just waiting for the right time to dissolve the partnership. That is consistent with the narrative he would construct, David agreed. He paused. She also asked me to tell you that she is immeasurably sorry. Isabel held the phone tight, the silence stretching across the miles, the clean scent of the lake air, the soft Illinois light, her mother's hand now resting on her shoulder through the open door. Let her know that I received her message, Isabel said finally, her voice surprisingly steady, and please tell her, I'm grateful. After the call, she remained in the sunroom, the morning light casting long shadows on the floor. She let the strange, heavy truth of the situation settle over her. The very person who had been a tool in her life's demolition was now, by her own choice, offering her an escape route. It was a bitter lesson in how help can materialize from the one source you would never expect. She walked back to her childhood home, into a kitchen filled with the aroma of brewing chamomile tea and the soft sounds of her father organizing his workshop. Chloe sat at the old wooden table overlooking the fog-draped hills of San Francisco, where each Victorian house seemed newly painted by the mist. The fog was starting to break, letting slivers of pale sunlight through. She considered what she wanted, not as a strategy, not as a desperate reaction, but what she, Chloe, fundamentally desired, the way a person does when they finally stop trying to shape their own soul into a form someone else will approve of. She wanted her daughter to be safe. She wanted her to know from her very first breath what a foundation of peace felt like. She wanted her room to be painted the color of the sky over the Golden Gate Bridge just after sunset. She wanted to hear her brother Michael's booming laugh over a family dinner. She wanted Sunday morning dim sum with her parents, coffee that was always perfectly strong, and the familiar, comforting clang of the cable car a few blocks away from a home that was hers alone. She wanted to reconnect with the woman she was before Ethan, the graphic designer who had fierce opinions about typography, who defended them with passion, and who never once checked her husband's face for permission after she spoke. She knew that person was still there, waiting. She had been quiet for too long. She decided it was time to be heard again. She took a sip of her coffee. That afternoon, Julian ignored the lawyer's directive to cease contact. He called her cell phone at 11:14. She watched his name light up the screen and let the call go to voicemail. He called again at 11:19. She hit the silence button. At 11:22, a text appeared. "Isabel, we can't let them do this to us. This is about our family. Please, call me." She took a screenshot and forwarded it to Marcus. Then she placed her phone screen down on the marble island and went outside into the garden to find her mother. Marcus called back 40 minutes later. His voice had a certain quality she was beginning to recognize. The unmistakable sound of a predator who had just seen its prey walk directly into a trap. "He's completely exposed himself, Isabella," the lawyer said, her voice crisp. "For the first time since this ordeal began, we are setting the pace." Isabella absorbed the word "we." She held on to it. "Explain the next move," she said. "First thing in the morning," the lawyer replied. "I have a conference call with the independent partners at the Croft Sterling design firm." 3 days later, the executive partners of Croft Sterling held an emergency meeting. Julian arrived at 7:58 for the 8 o'clock session, moving with the cool assurance he brought to any high-stakes negotiation. He was a study in calculated minimalism, projecting an air of total command that had been honed over a career of always being the most formidable mind in any room. He carried a single sleek tablet and wore a bespoke charcoal jacket, the one he put on for days when the world needed to be reshaped to his specifications. He'd run on 4 hours of sleep, but looked as if he'd had a full 8. He passed through the etched glass doors of the conference room and froze. The entire layout of the room was wrong. 3 partners he counted as his staunchest allies were positioned at the far end of the long marble table, nowhere near their usual seats. They were sitting beside 2 of the firm's most conservative founding investors, men he had always considered obstacles, not partners. This new configuration had a deliberate form, an obvious message that a veteran of boardroom politics would recognize in less than 3 seconds. It was the arrangement of a panel that had already made up its mind, a meeting convened not for discussion, but for a pronouncement. Julian Croft was a profoundly experienced veteran. "David," he said to the firm's senior partner, "what is the meaning of this?" David Chen was 71 years old, a man who had guided the firm through 4 decades of architectural trends and economic downturns. His face was a mask of perfect neutrality, a skill acquired by managing so many crises that he'd become immune to the drama. "It's your partnership, Julian," he said softly. "Please, take a seat." The meeting ran for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Julian commanded the flow of the discussion for almost the first hour. He was collected, articulate, and ruthlessly logical. He had arrived prepared for a battle. He painted the media inquiries as a coordinated attack fueled by misinformation. He framed Olivia's legal actions as a painful domestic situation, the choices of a woman experiencing immense personal strain, and insisted it posed no material threat to the firm's stability. He contended that taking a leave of absence would be seen as a sign of weakness by their competitors. The partners heard him out in total silence. Then the independent investors began their questions. Their queries were like scalpels referencing specific line items. Invoices for the Nest project, unauthorized use of proprietary rendering software for a non-company property, the timeline of a recent amendment to his post-nuptial agreement, and a significant transfer of capital to an obscure holding company. They had it all. Sometime during the second hour, Julian grasped that this evidence hadn't been gathered in some frantic, last-minute effort. It had been assembled with surgical care by professionals who knew precisely what to search for and had been given complete authority to do so. He knew in that single moment who had given them that authority. At the conclusion of 2 hours and 17 minutes, the partners voted 7-2, a mandatory indefinite leave of absence, pending an exhaustive external audit of his project financials and private server access, to be managed by a third-party agency. The Chief Operations Officer, Amelia Hayes, was appointed interim managing partner, effective immediately. A press release already drafted and vetted by several legal departments was slated for distribution at 4:15 that afternoon. Julian walked out of the conference room at 4:23. He moved through the sunlit atrium he had personally conceived, an expansive gallery of stone and glass he had brought to life, pacing past junior designers who suddenly found their monitors fascinating and project managers who became intensely focused on their blueprints. He strode past the interns, whose gazes dropped to the floor with well-practiced speed. He rode the private elevator down 52 stories, crossed the polished marble lobby, and was spun by the revolving doors onto a crowded Chicago street. A couple of architectural critics, writers he had cultivated for positive coverage for years, were there. They didn't yell anything. They simply lifted their cameras and documented the involuntary twitch of his hand rising to shield his face, his driver pulling the town car to the curb with uncharacteristic haste, and the clumsy retreat of a man whose entire reputation was built on the performance of absolute control, now escaping a skyscraper where his name would no longer inspire awe. Olivia knew none of the specifics. She was on her knees on a canvas drop cloth in the spare room of her family's home in Lincoln Park, assembling a brand new crib. It had been delivered that morning by her brother Marco, who had insisted that building something new is a lot healthier than dwelling on what's broken. It was light maple with clean, modern lines and simple, tapered legs. The smell of fresh-cut wood and beeswax polish filled the room, a scent that felt perfectly suited for the job of starting over. Marco was helping. This mainly involved him sitting on a pile of boxes, picking out a tune on his old guitar, and offering a stream of terrible, unhelpful advice. He'd just wrapped up a lyrical masterpiece about the existential dread of Allen keys when he tried to convince Olivia a crucial support beam was purely decorative. "Liv, I'm 90% sure that's just for looks," he'd said with authority about a piece the instructions clearly labeled as essential. But his presence and his off-key folk music was making her smile. It wasn't the polished, careful smile she produced for gallery openings and fundraising dinners, but a genuine one, the type that rises up from somewhere deep inside and surprises you. It felt like the most honest expression she'd had in a week. It was, without a doubt, the best part of the week. By 6 o'clock, they were finished. The crib stood near the window, its unstained wood glowing in the afternoon sun. One of the spindles was ever so slightly crooked, a permanent reminder of their 10-minute argument over the instruction diagram, which had clearly been drawn by a sadist. But it was sturdy. It was whole. It was waiting. Marco stood back, dusting his hands on his pants. "We actually made that," he declared, with the sincere wonder of someone who had just built a ship in a bottle. "You handed me the wrong screws 4 times, Olivia pointed out. "I was providing atmospheric motivation. It's a very advanced construction technique," he retorted. Olivia traced the smooth surface of the maple, admiring its clean grain and its one tiny flaw. The baby gave a slow, deliberate kick against her ribs, a small acknowledgement of the day's hard work, and the shifting world beyond the window. Olivia rested her hand on the spot. A profound ache in her shoulders, one she'd carried for so long she'd accepted it as permanent, began to ease. Marco noticed the change in her expression. He said nothing. He simply came over and leaned in the doorway beside her, and they both gazed at the crib in the fading light. The thing they had built. The thing that was ready. Her mother, Isabella, discovered them there a few minutes later. She paused in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room, the crib, her two children, the quiet sense of accomplishment hanging in the air. She observed them for a long moment, a woman witnessing a scene more valuable and delicate than she had allowed herself to imagine. "Have you thought of a name?" she asked softly. The list Olivia had saved on her laptop was gone, deleted from her hard drive 2 nights before. Every name on it belonged to a different person, a different path. She looked at the crib. "Matteo," she said, "for my father." Isabella made a small, tight sound, not a sob, but something very near it. It wasn't a dramatic statement, just something quiet and right. She gave a single nod. She looked at the crib one final time. "He would have been so proud of that," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "So very proud." That night, Olivia was awake in her childhood bedroom at 2 a.m. It wasn't fear or worry. It was the sharp, clear-headed stillness of a person who knows their world is about to be remade but cannot yet see the final shape. She thought of the hidden folder she'd found on their home server, Project Nightingale. She thought of the architectural plans for the penthouse, with a woman's name watermarked in the corner of every page. She thought of Julian, adjusting his $2,000 tie that morning, and she thought of 6 years spent carefully dulling her own instincts, making herself smaller, softer, less of a challenge. She thought of the gala where she'd let a donor drone on, incorrectly identifying a Rothko. She thought, "I was so worried about the person I was becoming in his world. I was afraid that if I stayed, I would eventually vanish, that there would be nothing left of the woman I used to be." And then the next thought, the one that was getting stronger now, "But I am becoming this person instead." She rested a hand on her stomach. Her son moved, as if to confirm it. Being awake at 2 a.m. was a trait they apparently already had in common. She inhaled deeply. She held her ground. The postnuptial agreement was contested in court a month after the discovery. Olivia's new lawyer, a woman named Davies, constructed her case with the silent precision of a grandmaster. The hidden project files were the opening salvo. The independent consultant who had supposedly audited their finances was discovered to be on the secret payroll of Julian's private development company. For an audit to be legitimate, it has to be impartial. The assertion that Julian's personal financial advisor had approved the 11th hour changes to their prenup was disproven by the advisor's own calendar, emails, and a signed declaration stating he'd never even been shown the final paperwork. The hidden real estate portfolio, which Julian had pitched to a sleep-deprived and pregnant Avery as a smart investment strategy, was exposed for what it was in encrypted messages between him and his broker, where they strategized how to frame it. So she wouldn't dig any deeper. Julian's legal counsel was a juggernaut, a team of top litigators from a powerhouse Chicago firm backed by a legion of paralegals. Mr. Thorne was simply more cunning. A judge granted an injunction, freezing all contested assets until a complete forensic audit could be performed. Avery's divorce filing cited the terms of their original prenuptial agreement, a contract written 6 years prior by a woman who believed she was building a life with an equal partner. The tech firm's board of directors initiated its own internal inquiry. Their findings, drafted in the sterile, detached language of corporate crisis management, cited material misappropriation of company funds for non-business-related acquisitions. Julian's temporary leave was officially upgraded to a termination. A settlement was reached. It was orchestrated quickly and mercilessly through proxies. On one side were Julian's personal attorneys and the crisis management team he'd hired. On the other, the board's legal team and, observing from afar, Mr. Thorne. The whole affair was settled in 8 days. Julian's forced departure was made public. He walked away with a severance that was a pittance compared to his expectations, gagged by a non-disclosure agreement forged from steel. Liam Vance was appointed the new chief executive officer. Liam phoned Avery himself to inform her. His tone was professional and to the point. Right before hanging up, he said, "I should have spoken up. I noticed things this past year, expense reports that didn't make sense. I let it go. I'm sorry." Avery told him, "You spoke up when it counted. You went to the board when it counted." A long pause stretched over the line. "Thank you for that," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "I mean it." "I know you do," she said. And it was true. The secret real estate holdings were untangled and liquidated. The company found its footing again under Liam's direction. Julian's father, one of the primary angel investors, quietly divested his entire stake. He never commented on the situation publicly. He didn't need to. Avery found a place in Lincoln Park. She discovered it with Leo on a sunny Tuesday morning, strolling down streets she hadn't visited in years. She'd forgotten, after 6 years of sterile penthouses and Julian's cold, severe taste, how much she adored this part of Chicago. The historic townhouses, the tree-canopied avenues, the small family-owned cafes. Her new home was the entire top floor of a classic graystone on a quiet, leafy street. It featured soaring, angled ceilings, 2 bedrooms, and a kitchen that was flooded with morning sun. The vista from the living room window was hardly spectacular, just a patchwork of rooftops and the brick wall of another building, but it belonged to her. She took the apartment. She painted the living room a shade called Morning Fog. It was a soft, silvery green. Her mother, standing in the doorway of the partially painted room that Saturday, commented, "You know, that's nearly the identical color of the walls in our first tiny place." Avery glanced around the room. "Is it really?" she asked. "Almost a perfect match," her mother confirmed. They left it at that. Some connections don't require further analysis. Some are simply real. She put the crib together herself in the second bedroom. It was a simple model she found online, and it arrived with a tiny scratch on the finish of one railing. She thought about sending it back, but then chose not to. It was sturdy. It would serve its purpose. She had adopted a new personal guideline: to cease searching for perfection in things that were already perfectly fine. She picked out a reading chair for the corner, a plush armchair covered in a deep charcoal gray chenille. She placed it by the window to catch the afternoon light. She sat in it for the very first time on a calm Monday evening. Alone in her new Lincoln Park apartment, she looked into the room she had designed for him. The simple wooden crib, the comfortable armchair, the gentle green of the walls in the living room visible just beyond the door. The muted sounds of the city floated up from the street below, a constant, gentle hum. A thought formed, not some grand declaration of victory, but something quiet and complete. "I made this. This is mine." It was a perfectly whole idea, and she cradled it with the same care she might use for a mug of hot tea in her sister's kitchen, letting it be everything she needed right then. She started therapy on a Thursday. Dr. Anya Sharma was in her early 50s with a keen intellect and a subtle, dry wit, and she had that particular kind of patience that is only earned by guiding countless people out of their darkest moments. She never approached Avery like a case to be solved. Her empathy wasn't for show. She just listened, asked incisive questions, and once in a while would say something that took the entire following week to truly comprehend. In their third session, she remarked, "It's interesting that your professional skill never went away. You only started acting as if it had." Avery chewed on that statement for the next 6 days. She thought about the Architectural Foundation Gala, how she had stayed quiet during a discussion about neo-futurist design, a field in which she had specialized. She thought about the 5 years she had practiced a milder, less assertive version of herself. I knew what to say, she realized. I always knew. I just started to think I wasn't allowed to say it. In their 5th session, she announced, "I need to find the woman I was before I met Julian." That woman had strong opinions and was never scared to defend them. Dr. Sharma asked, "And where do you suppose she is?" Avery answered, "She learned to be quiet, but I know she's still in here." Dr. Sharma nodded. "Oh, I have no doubt she never went anywhere." Isabel sent a single brief text. Just a few lines, brutal and sterile. Avery read it one time, sitting at her little desk on a Tuesday afternoon, her tea getting cold. After reading it, she blocked the number and closed the messaging app. She never looked at the message again, but she kept the screenshot she took of it. Some pieces of evidence are meant to be kept, even if you don't know why just yet. On a phone call with Chloe one night in August, Avery said, "You know what I keep thinking about? The person I was before all this. She was so confident. She had these enormous, brilliant ideas about structure and space and just shared them with the world." "So what became of her?" Chloe asked, her tone gentle yet firm. Avery thought for a moment. "I think I began to censor my own thoughts because it just felt less complicated," she finally confessed. "I rationalized it as being part of a team, that I was just being a good partner." A beat passed before she said, "I'm getting her back." Chloe's voice was full of warmth. "I never thought for a second she was gone, just buried under a pile of compromise, waiting for you to let her be amazing again." Avery let out a long breath. "Yeah." The silence that followed was easy, filled with years of understanding. "Yeah," she said again, almost a whisper. On a cool Monday in October at 6:52 a.m., Avery Croft gave birth to a baby boy. The labor had lasted for 17 hours. Her sister Chloe was present for every single one of them. She was a calm anchor in the storm, a presence that asked for nothing. She knew exactly when to bring a cup of ice chips, whispered encouragements when the contractions intensified, and pressed a firm, steady hand on Avery's lower back when the pain became nearly overwhelming. She just remained. She had done this for other people she loved, in other hospital rooms, and she knew that sometimes the most crucial role is to simply bear witness. The night before, she had shown up with a tote bag that held 2 different kinds of sports drinks, a bottle of plain water and one of sparkling in case taste changed. A hefty biography of a forgotten architect she had no intention of reading but found comforting, and a small hand-knitted octopus from the gift shop. She declared the octopus was for the baby but was also acting as her own personal emotional support creature, a logic Avery found perfectly sound. She set up a command post in the family lounge, sending out text updates that were, without exception, relentlessly positive. Utterly defeated and with nothing else to do, Julian walked the corridor. He moved with the caged energy of a man who had built an empire on managing every detail, now faced with a circumstance totally out of his control. In other words, he paced with immense purpose and accomplished nothing at all. Back and forth on the gleaming linoleum of the maternity ward for 16 hours. The nursing staff quickly learned his circuit, sidestepping him without a word. They brought him black coffee 3 times without being asked, which he accepted with the faintly puzzled appreciation of a person not used to being cared for. Julian was not in the room. Avery had known he would not be. The divorce was moving forward. The attorneys were in charge of all communication. There were logical, tactical reasons for his absence. The emotional truth of it was simpler. Lying in the delivery room around 3 in the morning, in that strange, heightened clarity that can come in the midst of a physical trial, a thought surfaced. There is no one in here who is putting on a show. There's no one in here I need to appease. There's no one I have to shrink myself for. There was just the project and the people she cherished. And then a sound, sudden and sharp and furious, as if Leo himself was outraged by his own abrupt arrival, as if he had been thrust into this new world, found it instantly lacking, and felt an immediate need to voice his complaints with the raw, unfiltered power and only a newborn possesses. Ilara laughed, a sound that was deep and genuine and instantaneous. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent a lifetime anticipating a singular melody and had finally, at long last, heard it play. And in the next heartbeat, she was weeping, openly and without restraint, right there in the birthing suite, the tears of someone who has clung to a delicate hope for so long and has just been granted the right to finally set it down. Ilara Vance cried in that room without an ounce of self-consciousness, and it was one of the most profound things Maya had ever witnessed. Julian was ushered in. He stood beside the bed, gazing at his son, so tiny, so flushed, and so thoroughly unimpressed with his recent journey from one existence to another, a sentiment he was broadcasting with a relentless, full-bodied wail. His expression shifted in a way Maya had never, in her 32 years of friendship with him. It was a change unlike any I had ever seen. His entire demeanor shifted, the rigid angles of his face softening in an instant. The defenses he had spent 3 decades constructing, the unflappable poise of a real estate mogul, the strategic way he navigated every negotiation, the entire carefully constructed persona of Julian Croft just dissolved. He was reduced to the most elemental thing a man could be, a father seeing his child for the first time. "Well, hello there, Leo," he whispered. Leo gave nothing in return. He had entered the world with a list of grievances already composed, and while they were not yet articulated, they were being conveyed with stunning force. This was a boy born with a clear agenda, and he was determined to present every single item. Julian sank into the chair beside the bed, reaching for his wife's hand. His eyes, however, stayed fixed on his son, his expression utterly exposed. There were no defenses up, no angles to play. In the months that followed, Ilara started to put the pieces of herself back together. It wasn't one grand cinematic moment or a montage of achievements, but the slow, methodical process of genuine healing. It was 2 steps forward and 1 step back, with sudden bouts of frustration and small triumphs that she often failed to recognize until they were far in the past. She went back to her work in March when Leo was 5 months old, not to a large corporate firm, but to a small elite architectural studio she launched with 2 women from her master's program, friends she had drifted away from during her marriage. The distance had grown so incrementally she hadn't realized it was happening until she found herself completely isolated from them. When she finally called, her voice thick with the hesitation of someone dredging up a past life, they were simply there. Immediately. Without a single question about the years in between. The studio's first year was solid. The second was brilliant. She maintained her therapy session every Thursday. With time, she noticed the subjects she brought to Dr. Sharma were shifting. She was no longer analyzing the collapse, the legal documents, the betrayal, the bitter arguments, but was now exploring subtler territories. The woman she was becoming. Her aspirations for the next chapter, the new identity she was painstakingly building, which was not a replica of the one that came before, because you cannot walk through that kind of fire and imagine you will emerge on the other side unmarked. And she had, finally, given up trying to. She was not the same woman she was before Julian. She was someone who had navigated a hurricane. She was someone who had been compelled to learn lessons she never would have chosen to enroll in. She was someone whose sense of self had been remolded by events rather than by design. She was, she realized one Thursday afternoon in Dr. Sharma's serene office, more truly herself than she had ever been in her life. She did not consider the idea of dating, not that year, not for some time. She knew that not for some time was a note about pacing, not a final verdict, and she was careful to respect that distinction. The Tribeca loft, over many months, became unequivocally hers, in the way only the quiet rhythm of daily life can make a place belong to you. She learned which floor-to-ceiling window caught the earliest morning rays and which one was perfect for the golden hour light. She knew the pour-over coffee was perfect if you let the water bloom for exactly 45 seconds. She learned that Leo, in his crib that was just a little too big for him, slept soundest with the white noise machine set to ocean waves and a thin slice of light from the hallway painting a line on the hardwood floor. She knew these details in the way you know the things that are intimately, irrevocably yours, completely hers. Ben and Chloe came for Sunday brunch. These visits, over the months, became the anchor she used to measure her weeks. The warm, exposed brick of her brother's kitchen, Chloe's steady presence, and Ben in the worn armchair, holding Leo with a practiced ease that made it seem he'd been a father for a lifetime instead of just an uncle for a few months. Leo recognized his voice early, the way babies learn the sounds that mean consistent warmth and security. He would turn his head toward the sound of Ben's keys in the lock, toward that familiar pitch, of Julian Croft's voice saying his name. She mentioned it only once, her voice a near whisper, to Ben as they sat in the kitchen after Chloe had gone home one Sunday. "He knows my voice." Ben said, "Of course he does, Ilara. He loves you." She said no more about it. She just held that knowledge, the way you hold on to things that finally appear after a long, agonizing wait. On a Tuesday morning in October, 9 months after the discovery, Ilara Croft sat at the small breakfast bar in her Upper West Side apartment and sipped coffee that was absolutely sublime. Leo was in his wooden high chair, the one with a slight rock to it that she'd picked out because it felt authentic, because she had made a silent promise that summer to welcome things that were beautifully imperfect. He was examining a slice of avocado with the intense concentration of a researcher about to make a major discovery. The fall sunlight came through the kitchen window at a specific angle. It cut in low, hitting the deep sapphire of the living room accent wall through the doorway and making it seem to glow with an internal warmth. It was a breathtaking light. It was a light she had trained herself to notice and to be thankful for, in the simple, present-tense manner of a person who has made a conscious choice to appreciate beauty wherever it shows up. Her tablet was on the counter. She didn't look at it. She hadn't looked at it in the first 20 minutes of her morning, which was a small win she couldn't have imagined for most of the last 5 years. She hadn't compulsively checked it 4 times. Unlock, refresh, lock, repeat. Desperate for a text from a man who rationed out affection based on whatever degree of suspense would keep her most off balance. She hadn't checked it once. It stayed on the counter, screen dark, and she let it remain there. Leo looked up from his avocado. He looked at his mother. He had his father's eyes, which were Julian Croft's eyes, the color of a stormy sea just before dusk. He had Ilara's mouth, which meant he had a mouth filled with expressions and a wide range of emotions he was keen to share with it. He put the avocado back on his tray. He reached out a small, plump hand. He laid it flat against Ilara's cheek, softly, the way very young children touch things they value, with open-ended curiosity and pure motive and zero hidden agenda. The way someone who has not yet been taught that the world requires you to hide your needs touches the face of the person who is, at that moment, their entire world. Ilara closed her eyes. She felt the small, warm pressure of her son's hand on her face, the same cheek, the same face that had once been met with a chilling indifference was now being touched with absolute love. And she knew, with her eyes closed in the autumn sun, that this was what healing actually was. Not the spectacular victory, not a feature in an architectural magazine, or a major commission in a new city, or a rival firm going out of business. This quiet, utterly flawless morning. She thought about the home office, the glint of the monitor as she stared at the credit card statement, at the charge for a bespoke necklace she had designed for him. The sharp, sickening jolt of it, her hand coming up slowly to cover her mouth. She thought about her car idling on the street, the 6 minutes she needed before she could walk into the new apartment, into the life that was hers alone. The immense chasm between the woman she had been staring at that screen that night and the one sitting here now. She thought about the prenuptial agreement and the 3 years of meticulous planning, the quiet, methodical chipping away at her creative independence by a man she had entrusted with her whole future. She thought about building the high chair on the floor with her friends, reading the baffling instructions out loud in silly voices. She thought about the 3 a.m. rocking sessions, sitting in the glider beside the beautifully imperfect high chair in the deep sapphire room. She thought about her new client saying, "You didn't lose your ambition, you just started to think it wasn't your turn to lead the project." In the 12 days since her mentor had said that to her over a video call, she'd replayed his encouraging smile in her mind. She pictured her sister Maria striding into the lawyer's office, already formulating a plan before Chloe had even finished her first sentence. She understood that the blueprint for her new life was already there. She thought, "I just needed one meticulously planned betrayal to finally give myself the authority to build it." Leo pressed his small hand against his mother's cheek, a gesture that was insistent, immediate, and utterly in the moment. Chloe opened her eyes. Her son stared back at her with his deep blue eyes, curious and direct, making no apologies for demanding her complete focus. Chloe smiled. It wasn't the diplomatic, practiced smile she had perfected for venture capital pitches and difficult clients, the one she used for the careful, constant managing of a powerful man's ego. It was the other kind, the one that starts somewhere deep inside and appears on your face without any conscious effort. Leo, apparently happy with this response, turned his focus back to a teething biscuit. Chloe picked up her coffee. Outside the window, the morning energy of Denver was rising. The city's distinct soundtrack began to build. The distant hum of the light rail, the cheerful shouts from the park across the street, and the everyday sounds of people moving toward the places their lives were taking them. It was the sound of a world that didn't require her to be smaller, that didn't ask for her to be a supporting character. A world that was just getting on with it and had a place for her. She sat with her coffee and her son in the crisp morning air. She thought about Sarah, who would message her later that day because Sarah messaged her every day, with the kind of steadfastness that shows true friendship isn't about grand gestures, but about quiet consistency. She thought about her Sunday call with her mentor, with Professor Albright in his paint-splattered studio, his canvases stacked against the wall, a constant source of inspiration. She thought about her new freelance design agency and the brand presentation she had scheduled for Thursday, and the bold, innovative concept she had sketched out late on Monday night after Leo had finally fallen asleep. She had been at her desk, the city lights twinkling below, her own design instincts flowing from her mind onto the tablet. She was creating what she believed in on a blank digital canvas without once stopping to question if the ideas were what a client expected. She thought, "I remember her." The version of herself she had set aside, the confident one, the one with a daring sense of color, the one who signed off on her own designs. She was not the same person she was before Richard. She was someone new, forged by everything, by the loyalty she had offered so freely and the trust she had given so completely, and by the 7 years and the tech conferences and the hidden folder on the cloud server and the rocking chair and the 2 a.m. feedings and the exposed brick walls and the coffee that was, at last, reliably and perfectly brewed. She was made of all of it, and she was more herself than she had been in years. The baby smacked his hand on the rocking chair's arm. This was a new habit. Leo had strong opinions about the appropriate speed of being rocked and was not shy about expressing them. "I'm on it," Chloe said. She stood up. With a gentle press of her fork, she pureed another slice of avocado, arranging it on the small plate beside her tea. This was her new ritual. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the minimalist decor of her high-rise apartment in San Francisco. Everything felt clean, intentional, and, most importantly, hers. The coffee had cooled to the perfect warmth. Far below, the city hummed with activity. Olivia placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the faint, reassuring flutter from within. She was here, in the quiet center of the future she was building for them, the one she'd fought for, the one she'd pieced together from the wreckage of a spectacular collapse, and she allowed herself to be completely and utterly at peace within it. A true fresh start, she now understood, was nothing like the dramatic tales people spun. It wasn't a single cinematic moment. It wasn't the day the lawyers finalized the asset division, or the day the expose on Julian's affair with his intern was splashed across every tech industry blog, or the day he was unceremoniously voted off the board of the company he built. It looked like this: fog rolling over the bay, the aroma of brewing coffee, and the silent promise of the new life growing inside her, a life with her own last name, with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been taught to make himself smaller. It looked like staying put. It looked like being right here in this normal morning, entirely herself, with no performance to maintain and no one's mood to manage but her own and her son's. No watered-down, more agreeable version of herself was needed here. It looked like this, exactly like this. Closing statement. This narrative was thoughtfully developed, composed, and personally reviewed by our creators, with the express purpose of sharing relatable emotional journeys and valuable life lessons with our community. Each piece is designed to affirm that your own story has worth, your resilience is powerful, and the next part of your life is always waiting for you to write it.